Two girls save a billionaire from a car accident. The next day, the police knock on their door and they discover something shocking. The sun had barely risen when Sophie opened her eyes, awakened by the familiar sound of coughing from the next room. Quietly, the 7-year-old slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold, worn wooden floor. She glanced at her 5-year-old sister, Claire, still fast asleep, an angel curled up beneath patched blankets. Sophie tiptoed across the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her steps. Their tiny apartment smelled of medicine and herbal tea. She paused at the slightly open door of her grandmother's room, watching the fragile figure sitting on the bed, struggling to catch her breath. "Grandma," Sophie called gently, stepping inside. "Should I bring you your medicine?" The elderly woman looked up, a tired smile lighting her wrinkled face. "My early morning angel," she murmured affectionately. "Don't worry about me, dear. Go play a little before breakfast." Sophie hesitated, her gaze drifting around the modest room, lingering on the prescription bottles on the nightstand and the stack of unpaid bills on the dresser. With a reluctant nod, she left, determined not to burden her grandmother with her worries. Minutes later, Sophie and Claire stood on the sidewalk in front of their rundown building, a faded red brick structure wedged between pawn shops and cheap diners. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir, with a few early risers hurrying by. "Let's play explorers," Claire exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Sophie smiled, giving in to her younger sister's enthusiasm. Together they began their expedition, turning the familiar street into an urban jungle brimming with imaginary adventures. Rounding a corner, the girls stopped abruptly. A surreal scene lay before them. A luxurious car, gleaming in the morning sun, had flipped onto its side, smoke escaping from its dented hood. The screech of twisting metal still echoed in the air. "Sophie, look!" Claire pointed, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. For a moment, Sophie stood frozen, her heart thumping in her chest. Then she saw movement inside the car, a pale hand pressed against the cracked windshield. "Someone's still in there," she gasped. Without a second thought, Sophie grabbed Claire's hand and ran toward the accident. As they approached, the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber filled the air. Sophie released Claire's hand. "Stay here," she instructed firmly, then moved closer to the wrecked vehicle. Crouching beside the driver's side window, Sophie saw a woman trapped in her seat. Her face was smeared with blood, but her eyes were open, fixed on Sophie with a mix of fear and hope. "Hang on, Mom," Sophie shouted, yanking on the door handle with all the strength her small body could muster. The door wouldn't budge. Claire, unable to stand still any longer, joined her sister. Together, they pushed and pulled, their muscles trembling with effort. Finally, with a metallic groan, the door gave way. "Claire, help me reach her," Sophie gasped. The sisters extended their hands, grasping the injured woman's arms. Carefully, they helped her out of the wrecked car, their small bodies taut with strain. The moment the woman was safely on the sidewalk, sirens blared in the distance. Sophie looked up to see adults rushing toward them, shock and admiration clear on their faces. The rescued woman, still dazed, looked at the two girls. Her elegant business suit was torn and stained, but there was a dignity about her that even the accident couldn't erase. You saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Sophie and Claire exchanged a look, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what they'd just done. Before they could respond, paramedics arrived, surrounding the injured woman. As the woman was placed on a stretcher, she reached out, gripping Sophie's wrist. "What's your name, my little heroine?" she asked. "Sophie," the girl replied, her voice almost a whisper. "And this is my sister, Claire." The woman nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Sophie and Claire," she repeated softly. "I will never forget you. Thank you." With those words, she was carried into the ambulance, leaving the two girls standing on the sidewalk, watching the vehicle pull away, sirens echoing through the city streets. Sophie felt a tug on her sleeve. Looking down, she saw Claire's wide eyes, filled with questions. "Sophie," she whispered, "who was that lady?" Sophie shook her head slowly, her gaze still fixed on the distant ambulance. "I don't know, Claire," she replied, "but something tells me we'll find out." The sisters stood there for a moment, holding hands, the world around them seeming bigger and more mysterious than ever. Then, remembering their grandmother at home, likely worried about their absence, they turned and headed back to their apartment. As they walked, Sophie couldn't help feeling that something had changed. The day that had begun like any other had become something extraordinary, and in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that this wouldn't be the last time they saw the mysterious woman from the car. With one last glance over her shoulder, Sophie squeezed Claire's hand and quickened her pace. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, with the same courage they had shown that fateful morning. The aroma of toast and weak coffee filled the tiny kitchen as Sophie and Claire walked in, breathless and their eyes shining with excitement. Their grandmother, Edith, was standing at the stove, slowly stirring a pot. Hearing her granddaughter's hurried footsteps, she turned, relief softening the worried lines on her aging face. "Girls, where have you been? I was about to go out looking for you," Edith exclaimed, her voice a mix of reprimand and relief. Sophie opened her mouth to reply, but Claire, unable to contain her excitement, blurted out, "Grandma, you won't believe it. We saved a lady from a flipped car." Edith's face went pale, and the spoon in her hand clattered into the pot with a dull thud. "You did what?" Sophie shot Claire a warning look before turning back to her grandmother. "Don't worry, Grandma. We're okay. There was a car accident nearby and we helped the lady get out of the car." Over the next few minutes, the girls told their story, their voices overlapping in their excitement. Edith listened, horror and reluctant pride mingling on her face. When they finished, she pulled both of them into a tight embrace, her arms trembling slightly. "You were very brave," she said softly, "but also very reckless. You could have been hurt." "But Grandma," Claire protested, "the lady needed help." Edith sighed, gently stroking her granddaughter's hair. "I know, dear. Just promise you'll let me know next time you decide to save the world, all right?" The girls giggled, nodding solemnly. The rest of the evening passed as usual, though Sophie couldn't help noticing the worried glances her grandmother cast her way when she thought Sophie wasn't looking. Early the next morning, Sophie woke to the sound of firm knocks on the apartment door. She sat up in bed, rubbing sleepy eyes, hearing her grandmother's hesitant footsteps in the hallway. "Claire, wake up," Sophie whispered, gently shaking her sister. "There's someone at the door." The two girls slipped quietly out of bed and crept toward the hallway, hiding behind the slightly open door to the living room. From there, they could see their grandmother speaking with two men at the entrance. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a police uniform. The other, shorter and sterner in appearance, wore plain clothes, but Sophie noticed the badge clipped to his belt. "Mrs. Edith Martinez?" asked the uniformed officer. "We're from the local precinct. We'd like to speak to your granddaughters about the accident yesterday." Edith hesitated, her hand gripping the doorframe. "They're just children," she protested weakly. "Surely there's no need." The plainclothes detective stepped in gently. "We understand your concern, ma'am, but your granddaughters may have crucial information. We promise to be brief and kind." Reluctantly, Edith nodded and opened the door wider. "Sophie, Claire," she called, her voice trembling slightly. "Could you come here, please?" The girls exchanged an uneasy glance before stepping out of their hiding place. They approached cautiously, instinctively positioning themselves on either side of their grandmother. The detective crouched to meet their eyes, his expression softening into a kind smile. "Hello, Sophie and Claire. My name is Detective Garcia. I hear you were very brave yesterday. Could you tell us what you saw?" Sophie, feeling the responsibility of being the older sister, stepped forward. With a calmness that surprised even herself, she recounted the previous day's events. Claire occasionally added details, her eyes wide with renewed excitement. As the girls spoke, Detective Garcia jotted down notes in a small notepad, occasionally exchanging meaningful looks with his uniformed partner. When Sophie finished her account, the detective stood slowly, his face now serious. "You two were very brave and observant," he praised. Then, turning to Edith, he continued in a graver tone, "Mrs. Martinez, there's something else we need to discuss. It might be better if the girls don't hear this part." Edith nodded, her expression tense. "Girls, Why don't you go to your room for a moment? Sophie was about to protest, but her grandmother's look silenced her. Taking Claire's hand, she retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind them. Still, driven by irresistible curiosity, Sophie pressed her ear against the thin wood. Detective Garcia's voice came through, muffled but audible. Evidence that the car's brakes were deliberately tampered with. We believe it wasn't an accident, but an attempt at... The rest of the sentence was lost as Claire tugged on Sophie's sleeve. What are they saying? She whispered. Shh! Sophie gestured for her sister to be quiet, straining to hear more. The woman your granddaughter saved is Anne Dubois, a very influential entrepreneur, the detective continued. There's a possibility whoever did this might come after witnesses. A chill ran down Sophie's spine. Witnesses. That meant them. Her grandmother's voice, shaky and frightened, drifted into the room. But they're just children, surely no one... We're taking all necessary precautions, Mum, the uniformed officer interjected. We'll increase patrols in the neighborhood and... Sophie pulled away from the door, her heart pounding. She looked at Claire, who stared back with wide, confused eyes. Sophie, Claire whispered. What's going on? Sophie forced a smile, trying to appear more confident than she felt. Nothing to worry about, Claire. The police just want to make sure we're safe. Before Claire could ask more questions, the bedroom door opened. Edith stepped in, her face pale but composed. It's all right, girls. The officers have left. Sophie studied her grandmother's face, noticing the deeper lines of worry around her eyes. Grandma, she began hesitantly. Are you really okay? Edith sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her granddaughters close. Of course, my loves, she said, her voice artificially cheerful. The police just wanted to be sure they knew everything about the accident. You were both very brave to help that lady. But Sophie didn't miss the tremble in her grandmother's hands, or how her eyes kept darting to the window, as though she expected to see some hidden threat lurking in the streets below. Now, Edith continued, standing up with a forced smile, how about some special hot chocolate? I think we all deserve a little treat today. While Claire jumped off the bed, delighted at the thought of an unexpected sweet treat, Sophie remained seated, her mind whirling. The excitement of yesterday's adventure had been replaced by a growing sense of unease. Who exactly was Anne Dubois? Why would someone want to hurt her? And more importantly, were they truly safe? As she followed her grandmother and sister into the kitchen, Sophie made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would protect her family, even if it meant unraveling a mystery far bigger than she could have ever imagined. In the days following the police visit, a tense hush settled over their tiny apartment. Sophie noticed how her grandmother double-locked the door at night, how she insisted the girls play indoors, how her gaze constantly swept the street from the living room window. A week after the accident, Sophie was helping Claire with a puzzle on the kitchen table when the phone rang. Edith answered, her voice low and cautious. The sisters exchanged curious glances, trying to catch snippets of the conversation. Yes, that's me. Oh, I see. Well, that's very kind, but... Edith paused, her face going pale. Anne Dubois. The Anne Dubois. Hearing the name, Sophie felt a jolt of excitement. She stood up abruptly, knocking a puzzle piece to the floor. Shh, Claire hissed, though her eyes also shone with curiosity. Edith continued speaking on the phone, her voice now a bit tremulous. Yes, I understand. It's very generous, but I'm not sure if... Well, if you insist, tomorrow. So soon. When Edith finally hung up, she turned to find her granddaughters staring at her expectantly. It was about the lady from the car, wasn't it? Sophie asked, barely containing her excitement. Edith nodded slowly, sitting down at the table. Yes, it was. That woman you helped. Her name is Anne Dubois. Who's Anne Dubois? Claire asked, puzzled. She's a very wealthy and famous woman, Edith explained. She owns several companies and she wants to see us, Sophie interrupted, her eyes wide. Edith hesitated before responding. Yes, she invited us to visit her estate tomorrow, as a thank you for what you did. Claire's face lit up. A real estate, with a giant house. Can we go, Grandma? Please? Sophie, however, noticed her grandmother's reluctance. "Grandma, you don't want to go?" Edith forced a smile. "It's not that, dear, it's just, well, it's a very different world from ours. And after what the police said—" "But Grandma," Sophie argued, "if it were dangerous, Mrs. Dubois wouldn't invite us, right? Besides, you always say we should be polite when someone extends an invitation." Claire nodded eagerly, backing her sister. Edith looked from one granddaughter to the other, her shoulders sagging in resignation. "All right," she sighed, "we'll go. But you both have to promise you'll behave and stay close to me at all times." The girls agreed enthusiastically, exchanging triumphant smiles. The next morning, nervous anticipation filled the air as the three prepared to leave. Edith insisted the girls wear their nicest clothes, even if it meant Sophie's dress was a bit short and Claire's shoes a little tight. At exactly 10 a.m., a gleaming black limousine pulled up in front of their shabby building. Sophie and Claire ran to the window, gaping at the luxurious car that seemed absurdly out of place in their modest street. "Girls, come on," Edith called, her voice tense. "And remember, best manners." They descended the rickety stairs, Edith holding each granddaughter's hand firmly. A uniformed driver awaited them, opening the limousine door with a flourish. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted politely. "Ms. Dubois is eager to welcome you." The interior of the car was a world apart. Plush leather seats, a small refrigerator stocked with juice and water, even a built-in television. Claire couldn't stop touching everything, while Sophie watched the city roll by through the window, marveling at the changing scenery as they drove into increasingly upscale neighborhoods. Edith, however, grew more tense with each passing mile. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and she barely glanced out the window, her eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead. "Grandma," Sophie asked gently, "are you okay?" Edith blinked, as though coming out of a trance. "Of course, dear. I'm just a little nervous. It's been a long time since I've been somewhere so elegant." But Sophie noticed something else in her grandmother's eyes. Not just nervousness, fear, recognition. Before she could ask more, the car began to slow. "We've arrived, ladies," the driver announced. They stepped out of the limousine, speechless at the sight before them. Anne Dubois' estate was an imposing structure of stone and glass, surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens. An ornate fountain graced the circular driveway, and Sophie could have sworn she saw a peacock strolling across the lawn. "It's like a castle," Claire exclaimed, her eyes shining with wonder. Edith squeezed the girls' hands. "Remember, girls, best manners," she murmured, though her voice trembled slightly. As they climbed the marble steps toward the grand entrance, Sophie couldn't help but notice how small her grandmother seemed, how fragile. Her eyes darted back and forth as though searching for something or someone. The enormous oak door swung open before they even reached it, revealing a poised woman in a flawless suit. Though a few bruises remained visible, her face was welcoming. "Sophie, Claire," Anne Dubois exclaimed, a genuine smile brightening her features. "My little heroines." The girls smiled bashfully, but it was Edith's reaction that caught Sophie's attention. Her grandmother stood frozen in place, her face a mask of shock and recognition. Anne Dubois turned her gaze to Edith, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The two women locked eyes, a flurry of emotions passing across their faces. "Edith," Anne whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it really you?" Edith swallowed, her voice trembling as she replied, "Hello, Annie. It's been a long time." Sophie looked from her grandmother to Anne Dubois, her mind racing. They knew each other. How? And why did her grandmother look so frightened? Before any questions could be asked, Anne regained her composure, her smile returning, though slightly forced. "Please, come in. We have so much to talk about." Following Anne inside the mansion, Sophie sensed they were stepping into a world far more complicated and mysterious than they had ever imagined. And somehow, her grandmother seemed to be at the center of it all. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than the exterior. Sophie and Claire gaped at the vaulted ceilings, paintings that looked impossibly valuable, and crystal chandeliers that glittered like suspended constellations. But the real focus, in that moment, was on the interaction between Edith and Anne Dubois. The two women walked side by side, their steps hesitant, as though treading unfamiliar and possibly dangerous ground. Their contrasts were striking. Anne, in her impeccable designer suit, and Edith, in her simple, worn dress. Yet there was a familiarity in their glances, one that transcended appearances, and it intrigued Sophie. Anne led them into a spacious living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the gardens, but no one seemed to notice it right then. "Please, have a seat," Anne said, gesturing to the leather sofas. Her voice held a subtle tremor, nearly imperceptible. Claire immediately plopped down onto one of the sofas, releasing a wow of admiration at its softness. Sophie, however, hesitated, her eyes on her grandmother. Edith looked as though she had aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Her hands trembled slightly as she perched on the edge of the sofa, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Anne sat across from them, her eyes never leaving Edith's face. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was so thick that Sophie could hear the tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Anne broke the silence. "Edith," she said softly, "after all these years, I never imagined—" Edith nodded stiffly. "Neither did I, Annie. It's quite a surprise." Sophie couldn't stand it any longer. "You know each other?" she asked, looking from one woman to the other. Anne let out a gentle laugh, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. "Oh, yes, dear. Your grandmother and I, we were best friends." "Best friends?" Claire echoed, her eyes wide. "Like me and Sophie." "Exactly like you and Sophie," Anne confirmed with a kind smile. "A long, long time ago." Edith seemed to find her voice. "We grew up together," she explained, her gaze drifting to distant memories. "We lived on the same street, went to the same school, pulled the same pranks," Anne added, a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. For a moment, the two women looked at each other, and Sophie glimpsed a spark of the friendship that once existed between them. Then, as quickly as it came, it vanished, and tension once again hung in the air. "What happened?" Sophie asked quietly. "Why did you lose touch for so long?" Anne's smile wavered. Edith averted her gaze, fixing it on her clasped hands. "Life happened, dear," Anne answered after a pause. "Choices were made, different paths taken. You went away to college," Edith said softly. "I stayed behind to care for my sick mother." Anne nodded slowly. "Then came marriage, business ventures. Before we knew it, decades had passed." Sophie watched the two women, sensing the weight of the years and unspoken words between them. There was so much more to this story, she could tell, so many complicated emotions behind the polite smiles and concise explanations. "But now you've found each other again," Claire piped up, her voice filled with childlike optimism. "You can be friends again, right?" Anne and Edith exchanged a look Sophie couldn't decipher. Hope was there, but so was apprehension, maybe even fear. "Of course, dear," Anne replied, though her tone wasn't entirely convincing. "In fact, that's why I invited you all here today, to reconnect." Edith shifted uncomfortably. "Annie, I don't know if—" "Please, Edith," Anne gently interrupted. "After what your granddaughters did for me, and after all these years, can't we at least talk?" A tense pause followed. Sophie held her breath, feeling this was a pivotal moment, even if she didn't fully understand why. Finally, Edith nodded slowly. "All right," she agreed. "I suppose we owe each other that." Relief was evident on Anne's face. She stood and walked to a nearby bookshelf. "I have something to show you," she said, picking up a large, dusty photo album. Returning, she opened the album, and Sophie and Claire leaned in to see. The pages were filled with black and white and sepia photographs of two young girls at different stages of life. "Look, Sophie," Claire exclaimed, "that's Grandma." Sophie peered closer, her heart pounding. There, smiling back at her, was a much younger version of her grandmother, and next to her, arms linked and faces beaming, was a girl who could only be Anne. "This was on our first day of school," Anne explained, pointing at one photo, "and here's our high school graduation." As Anne flipped the pages, narrating each photo, Sophie noticed a gradual change in her grandmother's demeanor. The tension in Edith's shoulders began to ease, and a genuine smile started to form on her lips. "Oh, Annie, you still have this?" Edith asked, pointing to a photo of the two girls wearing matching necklaces. Anne touched the picture fondly. "Of course I do, our friendship necklaces. Remember how we saved for months to buy them?" Edith laughed softly. "How could I forget? We vowed never to take them off." For a moment, the two women looked at each other, and Sophie saw decades of shared history pass between them, joys, sorrows, secrets. It was all there in the looks they exchanged. "I'm sorry, Edith," Anne said softly, "for letting life pull us apart." Edith swallowed hard, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm sorry too, Annie." Maybe it's not too late to fix things." Anne smiled, a smile full of hope and a touch of sadness. "I'd love that." Sophie watched with a mix of fascination and confusion. There was so much more to this story than what was being said, so many layers of emotion and history she could barely comprehend. But one thing was clear: this unexpected reunion was about to change their lives in ways none of them could predict. And Sophie, with her natural curiosity, was determined to uncover every secret these two old friends shared. As the two women continued to flip through the album, laughing and occasionally wiping away tears, Sophie made a silent promise to herself. She would unravel this mystery, no matter how complex it turned out to be, because something told her that her family's future depended on it. The scent of jasmine tea filled the room as Anne and Edith kept turning the pages of the photo album, their voices blending in a symphony of nostalgic laughter and sighs. Sophie and Claire sat on the plush carpet at their grandmother's feet, absorbing every word and image with growing fascination. "And here," Anne said, pointing to a photo of two teenage girls grinning in front of an old car, "was when we decided to take an impromptu trip to the beach. Remember that, Edith?" Edith let out a gentle laugh. "How could I forget?" "The car broke down halfway, and we had to push it for miles." "You pushed a whole car?" Claire asked, her eyes wide with admiration. "Well, we didn't have much choice," Anne answered with a mischievous smile. "But you know, sometimes the best adventures are the ones that don't go exactly as planned." Sophie noticed a sparkle in her grandmother's eyes she'd never seen before. It was as if these stories were awakening a part of Edith that had lain dormant for a long time. "And that time we secretly signed up for the school talent show," Edith added, her face lighting up at the memory. Anne laughed out loud. "Oh goodness, our dance routine was a complete disaster." "But we won most original performance," Edith chimed in, winking at the girls. Sophie and Claire exchanged amazed looks. It was hard to imagine their grandmother, always so serious and concerned, as a carefree teenager pulling pranks. "Grandma," Sophie began hesitantly, "you and Miss Dubois seemed so close. Why did you stop talking for so long?" Edith's smile faltered, and she exchanged a quick glance with Anne. For a moment, the silence weighed heavily in the room. Anne spoke first. "Well, dear, sometimes life takes us in different directions. I went off to college in another city, and your grandmother stayed here to care for her family." "But couldn't you visit each other?" Claire asked innocently. Edith sighed. "At first, we tried to keep in touch. Letters, phone calls. But over time, it got harder. Annie was busy with her studies and new friends, and I had responsibilities here. And then," Anne continued, her voice turning softer, "there were misunderstandings. Things we said or failed to say. Before we knew it, years had gone by." Sophie frowned, sensing there was more to the story than they were telling. She was about to ask another question when a shrill phone ring cut through the air. Anne stood abruptly. "Excuse me, I have to get this," she said, her voice suddenly tense. She left the room quickly, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. Sophie watched her grandmother closely, noticing how Edith's posture stiffened, her eyes following Anne with a mix of worry and fear. Minutes ticked by, and the tension in the room was palpable. Even Claire, usually chatty, remained quiet, sensing that something was off. When Anne finally returned, her face was pale and her hands trembled slightly. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Is everything okay, Annie?" Edith asked gently, unconsciously using the childhood nickname. Anne nodded stiffly. Yes, yes, just urgent business. You know how it is. But Sophie could tell it wasn't just business. There was a fear in Anne's eyes that hadn't been there before. Maybe, Anne continued, her voice too bright, we should take a walk through the gardens. The day is too beautiful to stay indoors, don't you think? As everyone stood to follow Anne, Sophie noticed her grandmother hesitate, her eyes locked on her longtime friend. Annie, Edith said quietly, resting a hand on Anne's arm. Are you sure everything's all right? For a moment Anne's mask slipped, and Sophie caught a glimpse of panic, desperation. Just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a convincing smile. Of course, Edith. Don't worry, Anne replied, patting Edith's hand. Come on, the girls will love seeing the peacocks. As they followed Anne outside, Sophie couldn't help but notice how both women's demeanors had changed. The easy camaraderie of earlier had been replaced by a nearly tangible tension. Whatever that phone call had been, it stirred up something both women were trying to hide. And Sophie, with her keen mind and insatiable curiosity, was determined to find out what it was. As they strolled through the lush gardens, with Claire running ahead to admire the exotic flowers and majestic peacocks, Sophie lingered behind, watching the two older women carefully. They walked side by side, but there was now a distance between them that hadn't been there before. Occasionally, they exchanged loaded glances, as if having a silent conversation no one else could hear. A shiver ran down Sophie's spine. There were secrets here, deep and potentially dangerous ones. And somehow she knew they weren't just in the past. They were alive, breathing, threatening to erupt into the present at any moment. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the immaculate lawns, Sophie made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover this mystery, no matter the cost, because something told her family's future, and perhaps much more, hung in the balance. The walk through the gardens ended, and the group returned to the cool interior of the mansion. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, creating intricate patterns on the marble floor. As Anne and Edith headed to the living room for a cup of tea, Sophie saw her chance. Ms. Dubois, she began, her voice brimming with barely contained curiosity. May we explore the house a little? We'll be very careful. Anne hesitated for a moment, throwing a quick glance at Edith. Well, I suppose there's no harm. Just don't enter any locked rooms, all right? With an eager nod, Sophie grabbed Claire's hand, and the two set off on their mini-adventure. The mansion was a maze of opulent hallways and grand rooms. Each space seemed to tell a different story. A library with shelves stretching to the ceiling, a music room with a gleaming grand piano, a game room with an antique pool table. It was in a second-floor hallway that something caught Sophie's attention. A series of photographs lined the wall, all of them featuring a young man at different stages of life. Claire, look, Sophie whispered, tugging her sister closer. This must be Mrs. Dubois' son. The photos showed a dark-haired boy growing up. First a smiling baby, then a child in a school uniform, a teenager holding a tennis trophy, and finally a young adult in a college graduation gown. He looks nice, Claire commented, her eyes fixed on the last picture, where the young man smiled beside Anne, both dressed formally, as if for a gala event. Sophie nodded, but something about the photo unsettled her. The young man's smile didn't reach his eyes. They looked distant, almost cold. I see you found Thomas's photos, Anne's voice sounded behind them, making the sisters jump. Sorry, we didn't mean to snoop, Sophie apologized, feeling a flash of guilt. Anne smiled, but sadness flickered in her eyes as she looked at the pictures. Don't worry, dears. This is my son, Thomas. He doesn't live here anymore. Where is he now? Claire asked innocently. A flicker of pain crossed Anne's face. To be honest, I'm not sure. Thomas has been distant lately. And we haven't spoken in a while. Sophie picked up on the hurt in Anne's voice and felt a pang of sympathy. She was about to ask more when footsteps approached. Her grandmother appeared at the end of the hallway, her face going pale at the sight of Thomas's photos. Annie, Edith said softly, maybe we should go back to the living room. It's getting late. But Sophie couldn't help noticing how her grandmother's eyes lingered on Thomas's photos, a strange expression on her face. Recognition? Fear. As they made their way downstairs, Sophie sensed a shift in the mansion's atmosphere. The shadows seemed deeper, the hallways longer and more foreboding. A chill rippled through her, and she instinctively moved closer to Claire. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, making everyone freeze in their tracks. It sounded like breaking glass, coming from somewhere upstairs. "What was that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Anne frowned, her posture growing rigid. "Probably just the wind knocking something over. I'll have one of the staff check it." But Sophie noticed the alarmed look Anne and her grandmother exchanged. Clearly, neither believed it was just the wind. They continued on to the living room, but the relaxed atmosphere from before had vanished. Anne seemed distracted, her eyes flicking often to the door, as though expecting someone or something to appear. Edith, for her part, was restless, her hands wringing nervously in the fabric of her dress. "Annie," she began hesitantly, "maybe we should go. It's getting late. And the girls—" Before Anne could respond, the lights flickered, momentarily plunging the room into darkness before coming back on. Claire let out a frightened squeak, clinging to Sophie. "That happens sometimes," Anne said quickly, though her voice quivered slightly. "The electrical system is old." Sophie, however, was unconvinced. She caught how Anne glanced nervously at the phone on the side table, as if expecting it to ring at any moment. An uneasy silence fell over the room. The tick-tock of the grandfather clock sounded deafening in the sudden stillness. Sophie could feel her heart pounding, an ominous sense of danger roiling in her stomach. That was when she noticed something odd, a faint but distinct smell that hadn't been there before. The smell of cigarette smoke. "Is someone smoking?" she asked, her voice slicing through the quiet like thunder. Anne visibly paled. "Impossible," she murmured. "No one here smokes, and the staff knows it's not allowed indoors." Edith stood abruptly. "Annie," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands, "I think it's time for us to go." But before anyone could move, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from upstairs, approaching the staircase. Anne's face went as white as a sheet. This can't be," she whispered. Sophie watched in horror as fear took over Anne's features. Whoever was coming, they were not welcome. "Girls," Edith said urgently, pulling Sophie and Claire close. "Stay beside me." The footsteps grew louder with each second. Sophie felt Claire trembling next to her and squeezed her sister's hand, trying to project a courage she didn't feel. Anne stood slowly, her eyes locked on the living room door. Her posture was rigid, like she was bracing for a confrontation. When the steps halted outside the door, the ensuing silence was deafening. Sophie could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. The doorknob turned slowly. Sophie held her breath, her body tensed like a drawn bow. Whoever was on the other side of that door, she instinctively knew their arrival would change everything. The door creaked open, and in that moment, Sophie understood that the shadows of the past had finally caught up with the present, bringing with them secrets and dangers beyond her imagination. The door swung open slowly, revealing not the feared intruder, but a middle-aged man in a discreet dark suit. His face was a mask of professional seriousness. "Ms. Dubois," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk in private." Relief flooded Anne's features, only to be quickly replaced by concern. She turned to Edith and the girls, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "My dears, I'm sorry, but my head of security, Robert, needs to update me on something. Why don't you head to the kitchen and ask Mrs. Thompson to prepare some snacks?" Edith nodded, understanding this was a prompt to leave. "Come on, girls," she said, guiding Sophie and Claire out of the room. As they walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, Sophie couldn't help but notice the sudden surge of activity in the mansion. Men in suits, much like Robert, moved discreetly through the corridors, speaking into radios in hushed, urgent tones. In the spacious and spotless kitchen, a kindly, stout woman, Mrs. Thompson, greeted them with a tight smile. "Ah, you must be Ms. Dubois' guests. What can I get for you, young ladies?" While Claire perked up at the mention of treats, Sophie stayed quiet, her mind churning. Something was very wrong here, and she was determined to find out what. 15 tense minutes passed before Anne reappeared in the kitchen. Her face was pale, and her hands shook slightly as she accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Thompson. "Edith," Anne said, her voice strained, "may I speak with you for a moment?" "Alone?" The two women left the kitchen, leaving Sophie and Claire under Mrs. Thompson's watchful eye. But Sophie, driven by an irresistible curiosity, mumbled an excuse and slipped out, following them silently. Hidden behind an ornate column, Sophie overheard the whispered conversation between Anne and her grandmother. "Anonymous threat," Anne was saying, her voice trembling. "They claim to have Thomas and Edith. My son." Sophie felt a chill crawl down her spine. Thomas, Anne's estranged son, was in danger. "Oh, Annie," Edith said softly, full of compassion. "Are you sure? Could it be some horrible prank?" "No," Anne replied firmly. They know things, Edith. Things only Thomas would know. I'm terrified." A pause followed, and Sophie imagined her grandmother comforting her old friend, offering silent support. "What do they want?" Edith finally asked. "Money, of course. But not just that. They mentioned the past, Edith, our past." Silence weighed heavily again, charged with meanings Sophie couldn't fully grasp. "Annie," Edith's voice was firm now. "What exactly is going on? Is there something you're not telling me?" Anne let out a shaky sigh. I don't know, Edith. I'm afraid the mistakes of our past are coming back to haunt us, and now Thomas is caught in the middle." Sophie slipped away quietly, her mind spinning with new revelations. Back in the kitchen, she found Claire happily enjoying a chocolate sundae, blissfully unaware of the tension gripping the mansion. Over the next few minutes, the activity in the house ramped up dramatically. More men in suits arrived, some carrying what looked like security equipment. Curtains were drawn, doors were locked, and a sense of confinement began to set in. When Anne and Edith finally returned to the kitchen, both looked composed, but Sophie could see the fear lingering in their eyes. "Girls," Anne said with a forced smile, "I'm afraid we have to cut our visit short. Some urgent matters have come up." Claire pouted, disappointed, but Sophie nodded solemnly. She knew something far bigger than a shortened visit was going on. As they prepared to leave, Sophie noticed the security men watching them closely, as though they, too, could be a threat. The mansion's atmosphere had shifted entirely, from welcoming to claustrophobic, from nostalgic to dangerous. Near the exit, Anne pulled Edith aside one last time. Sophie, pretending to tie her shoelace, managed to catch fragments of their conversation. "Keep your eyes open, Edith. Trust no one. But what about the girls? Are they safe?" "I hope so. But be careful. If anything happens..." The final words were drowned out as Robert E., the head of security, approached, indicating it was time to go. In the car that took them back home, Sophie watched her grandmother in the rearview mirror. Edith looked like she'd aged 10 years in a single afternoon, her hands clutching her purse nervously in her lap. Claire, exhausted from the day's excitement, quickly fell asleep, her head resting on Sophie's shoulder. But Sophie stayed alert, her mind brimming with questions. Who was threatening Anne? What had happened to Thomas? And what past secrets were so dangerous they could put everyone at risk in the present? As the mansion disappeared into the distance, Sophie made a silent promise to herself. She would find out the truth, no matter the cost, because something told her the safety of her family, and perhaps much more, depended on it. The sun had barely risen when the phone rang, jolting Sophie from a fitful sleep. She heard her grandmother's muffled voice in the hallway, speaking in urgent, worried tones. Minutes later, Edith entered the girls' bedroom, her face etched with barely contained concern. "Girls, get up," she said softly. "We need to go back to Ms. Dubois' estate." "But why?" Claire asked groggily, rubbing her eyes. "Anne, Miss?" "Dubois needs our help," Edith replied vaguely. "Get dressed quickly, please." Already on alert, Sophie noticed the tremor in her grandmother's hands as she helped Claire dress. Something serious had happened. An hour later, they were back at the Dubois estate, but the atmosphere was drastically different from their last visit. Security cars were parked out front, and men in suits patrolled the grounds. Robert, the head of security, met them at the door, his face grim. "This way, please," he said, ushering them quickly inside. In the living room, they found Anne. She looked as though she'd aged years since the previous day, her face pale, dark circles under her eyes. But it was the young man seated on the sofa, his head in his hands, that caught Sophie's attention. "Thomas," Sophie whispered, recognizing him from the photos. Anne's son lifted his head at the sound of his name. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a palpable aura of despair around him that made Sophie instinctively step back. "Oh, Edith, you came," Anne said, her voice trembling with relief. She turned to her son. "Thomas, dear, these are Edith and her granddaughters. They're friends." Thomas nodded vaguely, his eyes scanning the group before focusing on a distant point. Anne motioned for everyone to sit down. "Thomas showed up early this morning," she explained in a hushed voice. He's not okay." Sophie watched as Anne tried to talk to her son, asking gentle questions that were met with monosyllables or silence. The tension in the room was thick. "Thomas, please," Anne begged. "You have to tell me what happened. Who were those people? Why were they threatening you?" Thomas flinched visibly. "I can't, Mom," he mumbled. They're still out there. It's not safe." Sophie and Claire exchanged puzzled looks. Who were they? And why did Thomas seem so terrified? Suddenly, Robert entered the room, his expression grim. He leaned in to whisper something in Anne's ear, causing her eyes to widen in alarm. "They're here," she gasped. Robert nodded somberly. Instantly, the room's atmosphere shifted. Anne stood, her posture rigid. "Edith, take the girls upstairs. Now." Edith didn't hesitate, grabbing Sophie and Claire's hands and hustling them out of the room. But Sophie, ever observant, couldn't help seeing the panic on Thomas's face, or the way Robert discreetly checked his firearm. Upstairs, Edith led them to a guest bedroom, locking the door behind them. "Stay here and stay quiet," she instructed, her voice trembling. "Grandma, what's going on?" Sophie asked, her curiosity overpowering her fear. Edith hesitated. I'm not entirely sure, dear, but it seems Thomas is in some kind of trouble. Bad people might be looking for him." Claire clutched Sophie's hand, her eyes huge with fear. "Are we in danger?" No, Edith quickly reassured them, though Sophie saw the uncertainty in her eyes. "Ms. Dubois' security will protect us." The minutes dragged on like hours. Sophie could hear muffled voices from downstairs, occasionally rising in volume before quieting again. She approached the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. What she saw made her heart pound. Several dark cars had arrived, and intimidating-looking men were speaking with Robert in the front garden. They did not appear friendly. "Sophie, get away from the window," Edith hissed, pulling her aside. More time passed. Claire had dozed off in Edith's lap, worn out by the tension, but Sophie remained wide awake, her mind racing with theories and possibilities. Finally, a soft knock sounded on the door. Anne's voice came from the other side. "Edith? Girls? It's all right now. You can come out." When they returned to the living room, Sophie immediately spotted the changes. Thomas seemed even more on edge, if that was possible. Anne was pale, but there was a resolve in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I apologize for the disturbance," Anne said, trying to smile. "There was a misunderstanding with some of Thomas's business associates. But it's all settled now." Sophie, however, didn't believe that for a second. She sensed the tension in the air, saw the fear in Thomas's eyes, noticed how Robert and the other security officers remained on high alert. As the adults spoke in hushed tones, Sophie wandered toward one of the windows. Outside, one of the dark cars still sat on the street, a man in sunglasses watching the mansion. He did not look like someone who had just resolved a misunderstanding. Turning back to the room, Sophie took everything in again. Thomas was whispering something urgently to his mother, who shook her head in denial. Edith watched them both, her face a mix of worry and guilt. In that moment, Sophie realized she stood at the heart of something far larger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. The mysteries were deepening, the threats mounting, and somehow she knew her family was inextricably involved. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Sophie made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover the truth behind it all, because something told her everyone she cared about depended on it. The immediate danger had passed, but Sophie knew this was far from over. A storm was brewing, and she was determined to find a way through it. Night fell over the Dubois estate like a heavy curtain, bringing with it an oppressive sense of impending danger. Sophie stood by the guest room window, her sharp eyes scanning the garden's shadows. Dark figures moved furtively among the trees, their silhouettes faint under the dim glow of the lamps. "Sophie, step away from the window," Edith whispered, gently pulling her granddaughter back. "We don't want to draw attention." Claire slept fitfully on the king-sized bed, murmuring unintelligible words in her dreams. Reluctantly, Sophie stepped away from the window, though her mind remained on high alert, piecing together the puzzle unfolding around them. A soft knock on the door startled both of them. Robert, the head of security, entered silently. "Mrs. Martinez," he said in a low voice, "Ms. Dubois would like to speak with you, in private." Edith gave Sophie a worried glance before following Robert out of the room. Compelled by curiosity, Sophie waited a few seconds, then slipped into the corridor, trailing them quietly. In the downstairs library, Sophie hid behind a bookshelf, listening to the tense conversation between Anne, Edith, and Robert. "The threats are becoming more specific," Anne was saying, her voice shaking. "Now they're threatening to harm Thomas if they don't get what they want." "What exactly do they want, Annie?" Edith asked softly. A heavy pause hung in the air before Anne replied, "Money, of course, but also information about the project Thomas was working on and about the past, our past." "Edith." Sophie's heart thumped harder. What secrets from the past could be so valuable that everyone was in danger? "Mrs. Dubois," Robert's grave tone interjected, "we need to consider evacuating. The estate is no longer secure." "No," Thomas burst in, his voice laced with panic. "We can't leave. They'll find us. They always find us." "Calm down, son," Anne tried to soothe him. "No one is going anywhere just yet. Robert, what are our options?" "We've reinforced security at every entry point. Men are patrolling the perimeter 24/7. But..." Robert hesitated. "If they decide to attack in force, I'm not sure how long we can hold them off." A chill ran through Sophie. The situation was even more serious than she'd feared. "What about the police?" Edith suggested. "We can't trust them," Thomas answered quickly. "We don't know who might be involved." Silence followed, heavy with fear and uncertainty. "Annie," Edith spoke up at last, her voice steady. "You need to tell me everything. What exactly did Thomas find? And how does it tie into our past?" Anne sighed shakily. "It's complicated, Edith. Thomas was working on an advanced research project, something involving renewable energy. But he discovered something very powerful people don't want revealed. And the past," Edith pressed. "Remember that summer, all those years ago? The incident at the beach?" Anne's voice was barely a whisper. "It appears this is somehow connected to what Thomas uncovered. I don't fully understand, but..." The sound of shattering glass cut her off. Shouts and the thud of heavy footsteps echoed through the mansion. "They're here." Robert's voice was tense. "Ms. Dubois, Mrs. Martinez, follow me. We need to get you out right now." Sophie, heart in her throat, fled back to the guest room. She shook Claire awake. "What's happening?" Claire asked groggily, fear creeping into her voice. "We have to go," Sophie said, pulling her sister from the bed. Seconds later, Edith burst into the room. "Girls, hurry! We have to leave." They dashed down a back staircase Sophie hadn't even known was there. The sounds of conflict and shouting grew louder by the second. In the mansion's basement, they found Anne, Thomas, and Robert, along with 2 other security guards. "This way," Robert indicated, revealing a hidden passage behind a bookcase. "It'll lead us off the property." As they hurried through the dark, damp tunnel, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about all the unanswered questions. Who were these people? What had Thomas discovered that was so dangerous? And how were her grandmother and Anne connected by some long-ago event? After what felt like an eternity, they emerged in a clearing in the woods bordering the estate. 2 black SUVs waited. "Split up," Robert instructed. "Miss Dubois, Thomas, and the girls in one car, Mrs. Martinez and I in the other. We'll go separate ways and meet at the safe point." "No," Sophie cried, clutching her grandmother's hand. "I don't want to be separated." Edith knelt, looking Sophie in the eye. "Sweetheart, it'll be all right. Trust me. We'll see each other soon." With a heavy heart, Sophie climbed into the SUV with Claire, Anne, and Thomas. As the vehicle sped down the dark road, she looked out the rear window, watching the other car head off in the opposite direction. "Where are we going?" Claire asked, her voice small and scared. Anne forced a reassuring smile. "To a safe place, dear. Don't worry." But Sophie saw the fear in Anne's eyes, the tension in Thomas's body. They weren't safe, not yet. As the SUV wound through back roads, Sophie made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth behind all of this. Because now, more than ever, she knew that finding the answers was key to keeping everyone she loved safe. The net might be closing in, but Sophie was determined to find a way out, no matter how impossible it seemed. The SUV maneuvered through dark, winding roads, sinking deeper into the night. Sophie kept her gaze glued to the window, watching the silhouettes of trees blur by, her heart beating a frantic rhythm. Beside her, Claire had finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her head on Sophie's shoulder. Up front, Anne held a hushed, tense conversation with the driver, while Thomas glanced repeatedly at the rearview mirror, his face a study in fear and guilt. Suddenly, the driver cursed under his breath. "We've got company," he announced, voice tight. Sophie twisted in her seat to see 2 pairs of headlights closing in fast. "Faster!" Anne ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. The engine roared as the driver floored the accelerator. Sophie held Claire tighter, fear rising in her chest. "They don't give up," Thomas muttered, seemingly to himself. "They never give up." "Who are they, Thomas?" Anne demanded, a mix of fear and frustration in her voice. "What exactly did you do?" Before Thomas could answer, a deafening crack rang out. The SUV lurched. A tire had been shot out. "Hold on!" the driver yelled, fighting to keep the vehicle under control. The SUV skidded violently, veering off the road and slamming into a tree. The impact was brutal, throwing everyone forward. The airbag deployed, saving Anne and the driver, but Sophie felt her head strike the seat in front of her, stars bursting in her vision. "Claire," she croaked, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" A low groan was her sister's only reply. "Out of the car," Anne commanded urgently. "Quickly." Sophie helped Claire out, relief flooding through her at the sight of her sister, scared but apparently unharmed. Thomas and Anne scrambled from the wreck, followed by the driver who drew a gun. "This way," he indicated, pointing toward the dense forest at the roadside. They had barely taken a few steps when the pursuing car's headlights swept over them. Doors slammed, and harsh voices barked orders. "Run!" Anne shouted, shoving the girls ahead. Sophie gripped Claire's hand, pulling her into the darkness of the woods. Branches lashed their faces as they ran, the sound of heavy footsteps and shouting echoing behind them. A gunshot tore through the night, followed by a cry of pain. Sophie glanced back in time to see the driver fall, clutching his leg. "Don't stop!" Anne cried, pushing them onward. They ran until their lungs burned and their hearts pounded. At last, Anne pulled them behind a large boulder, all of them panting and trembling. "Thomas," Anne whispered urgently, "who are these people? What do they want?" Thomas swallowed, his eyes filled with guilt. "They're from the Nexus Corporation, the project I was working on. It could change everything. Mom, clean, unlimited energy. But they want to use it for other purposes. Terrible ones." Sophie felt a cold shiver. The Nexus Corporation. She recalled hearing the name whispered in tense conversations between her grandmother and Anne. Before anyone could ask further, a voice boomed through a megaphone. "We know you're out there. Come out with your hands up. We've got this place surrounded." Anne looked at Thomas, then at the girls, her face set in grim resolve. "Stay here," she ordered. "Do not move, no matter what happens." "Mom, don't," Thomas pleaded, but Anne was already standing. Sophie watched in horror as Anne stepped out from behind the boulder, hands raised. "I'm here," she shouted. "Leave the children alone. They have nothing to do with this." Blinding flashlights pinned Anne in their beams. Dark figures emerged from the shadows, guns raised. "Where is Thomas Dubois?" demanded a cold, gravelly voice. "He's not here," Anne lied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's just me." A tall, imposing man moved closer, his face partially hidden by sunglasses, even in the dark. "Mies Dubois," he said, his tone icy. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We know your son is here. And we know about the project." Sophie felt Thomas tremble beside her. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the urge to surrender to protect his mother, battling his fear of what might happen if he did. "I don't know what you're talking about," Anne insisted, her voice firm. The man sighed, a sound of mock compassion. "Miss Dubois, we have ways of making you talk. Ways you won't like." In that instant, Thomas made a move, ready to leap from his hiding place. Acting on pure instinct, Sophie grabbed his arm. "No!" she hissed urgently. "They'll hurt you." Thomas looked at her, startled by the intensity in her voice. He hesitated. That was when the wail of sirens split the air. Red and blue lights flashed among the trees, and authoritative voices shouted, "Police, freeze!" Chaos erupted. The Nexus men began backing away, firing warning shots into the air. Anne took advantage of the confusion to dash back behind the boulder. "Come on," she yelled, pulling the children along. They ran again, this time toward the police lights. Sophie could hear gunfire behind them, shouts and orders being yelled. Finally, they emerged into a clearing where Edith was rushing toward them, flanked by several officers. "Sophie! Claire!" Edith cried, wrapping her granddaughters in a fierce hug. "How?" Anne began to ask, but was cut off by another burst of gunfire. "No time for explanations," a police officer said urgently. "We need to get you out of here now." As they were escorted to police vehicles, Sophie looked back one last time. The forest was illuminated by the flashes of gunfire and the glow of flashlights. The standoff was still raging. In the back of a police car as they sped away, Sophie finally let the tears come. The immediate danger was over, but she knew this was far from finished. Glancing at Thomas, lost in dark thoughts, and at Anne and her grandmother exchanging meaningful looks, Sophie realized that the mysteries and secrets surrounding them were far deeper and more perilous than she'd ever imagined. The clash in the woods might have ended, but the real battle was just beginning. And Sophie was determined to discover the truth, no matter the cost. The police car sped through the night with silent sirens, lights flashing in frenetic rhythm. In the back seat, Sophie was wedged between Claire and her grandmother, while Anne and Thomas occupied the seat opposite. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the occasional shaky breath or muffled sob. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car stopped in front of an unremarkable safe house on the outskirts of the city. Officers quickly ushered them inside, checking every corner before declaring it secure. Once inside, the tension that had built up over their flight suddenly spilled over. "Enough, Thomas," Anne shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "I want the truth, all of it, now." Thomas sank into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, filled with tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice breaking. "All of this is my fault. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Sophie watched closely, feeling the weight of each word. Next to her, Claire pressed closer, seeking comfort. "Start at the beginning," Edith encouraged gently, resting her hand on Anne's shoulder in support. Thomas took a deep breath. "It all started about a year ago. I was working on the clean energy project and things were going well, but then I started gambling," Anne gasped, but didn't interrupt. "At first it was just for fun, some bets here and there. But soon it got out of control. I was losing more than I could afford. And the guys I was gambling with, they're not people you want to owe money to." Sophie shivered. She recalled the whispered mentions of debts and problems she'd overheard. "I tried to stop," Thomas continued, his voice quavering. "I swear I did, but every time I thought I was out, they pulled me back in with promises of big wins, chances to recoup what I'd lost." "How much?" Anne asked, her voice a hushed rasp. "How much do you owe?" Thomas swallowed hard. 3 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "My God, Thomas," Anne finally whispered, her face ashen. How did you think you would pay that?" "I didn't know what to do," Thomas admitted, tears now streaming down his face. "They were threatening to hurt me, to hurt you. That's when I came up with the idea of the accident." Sophie felt her grandmother tense beside her. The accident. The day it all began. "I thought if I staged an accident, maybe I could get insurance money, or at least buy some time," Thomas explained, shame coloring his cheeks. "I never imagined anyone would be there to save me, much less 2 brave little girls." He glanced at Sophie and Claire, gratitude and remorse swirling in his teary eyes. "You saved my life that day, and I put you in danger." "I'm sorry, so sorry." Anne moved then, pulling her son into a tight embrace. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, her voice raw, "why didn't you come to me? I would have helped you." "I was ashamed," he confessed, "and scared. These guys, Mom, they're not just gamblers. They're dangerous. They run a whole network of illegal casinos and betting. They have connections everywhere." At that moment, a police officer entered the room, his face grim. "Ms. Dubois, we've received intel that the men who chased you are part of a criminal organization known as the Kingpins of the Game. They control a vast underground gambling ring and have links to several shell corporations, including the Nexus Corporation." Sophie felt the pieces of the puzzle lock into place. The Nexus Corporation wasn't just a typical company interested in Thomas's groundbreaking work. Behind its polished facade lay a complex web of illegal gambling, shady dealings, and a vast criminal underworld. Now, because of Thomas's debts and the incredible potential of his clean energy invention, they had fixated their attention on the Dubois family. "But what about the project?" Sophie blurted, unable to hold back her curiosity. "The clean energy system you created, what's going to happen to it now?" Thomas looked at her, startled by her perceptiveness. "The project is real," he explained. "It has the potential to change the world. But the Kingpins of the Game, and the Nexus Corporation fronting for them, saw it as an opportunity. With unlimited, affordable energy, they could expand their operation in ways never before possible. Casinos everywhere, online betting systems impossible to track. And when you refused to hand the project over," Anne concluded, realization dawning in her eyes, "they used your debts as leverage against you." Thomas nodded miserably. "I had no idea what else to do. They threatened to expose my debts, ruin my career, hurt you, and I panicked." Anne rose and walked over to a window. For a long moment, she stood there, staring into the darkness outside. When she turned around, her expression was resolute. "We'll fix this," she declared firmly, "all of us together." Edith stood up, placing a hand on Anne's shoulder. "Annie's right. You're not alone in this." Sophie watched them both, feeling a swell of admiration. Despite everything, they remained strong and united. "But how?" Thomas asked, despair creeping into his voice. "They're too powerful. They have connections everywhere." Sophie suddenly spoke up, her voice small but resolute. "What if we use that against them?" she suggested. All eyes turned to her. "What do you mean, dear?" Edith asked gently. Sophie took a steadying breath. "If they have connections everywhere, it means they must have made plenty of enemies too. What if we find those people? Gather evidence?" Anne looked at the young girl with surprise and admiration. "You know, Sophie, you might be onto something." The officer who had entered before nodded thoughtfully. "She's right. With enough information, we could build a solid case against the entire organization, not just the henchmen who chased you tonight." Thomas still looked hesitant. "But that would be dangerous. Very dangerous. More dangerous than what we've just been through," Anne countered, a hint of her old strength returning to her voice. "Thomas, you made mistakes, serious ones. But you also created something amazing, something that could do good. We can't let these criminals steal that from you, from us, from the world." Sophie felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare. "What do we have to do?" she asked, determined to help in any way she could. Anne smiled at her, tired but genuine. "First, we need rest, All of us. Tomorrow, we'll start making plans. It won't be easy, and it certainly won't be quick. But together, I believe we can do it. As everyone settled in for the night, Sophie reflected on all that had happened. The truth had come to light, shocking and painful as it was. But with the truth came the possibility of healing, of redemption. Lying on a makeshift bed beside Claire, Sophie made a silent promise. She would do whatever she could to help the Dubois family, her grandmother, and everyone caught in the crossfire. Because now, more than ever, she understood the power of unity, courage, and honesty. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in days, Sophie felt a flicker of real hope. The truth was finally out, and with it came a chance for a new beginning. Dawn broke with an almost surreal calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. Sophie awoke to the soft murmur of voices in the next room. Carefully, so as not to rouse Claire, she got up and crept to the slightly open door. In the adjoining room, Anne, Thomas, Edith, and several police officers were gathered around a table covered in papers and maps. The chief inspector, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes, was speaking. "The security system at the Dubois estate gave us the alert we needed," he explained. "By the time we arrived, the Nexus men were already in retreat, but we managed to arrest several of them." Anne nodded, her face a mixture of relief and worry. "What about the others?" "The ones in charge? We're tracking them," the inspector replied. "The information your son provided is invaluable, Ms. Dubois. With it, we're uncovering an illegal gambling network that stretches throughout the city, possibly beyond." Sophie saw Thomas shrink back slightly at these words. He looked like he'd aged years overnight, the weight of his actions visibly pressing down on him. "So what happens now?" Edith asked, her voice gentle but firm. The inspector sighed. "Well, we have a lot of work ahead. We'll need detailed statements from all of you. And as for Mr. Thomas," Thomas lifted his head, meeting the inspector's gaze. "I'm ready to turn myself in," he said, his voice quavering slightly. "I know what I did was wrong. I'm prepared to face the consequences." Anne let out a small sob, quickly regaining her composure. "Thomas," she said, placing a hand on her son's shoulder, "I'm proud of you for making this choice. It won't be easy, but I'll stand by you every step of the way." Sophie felt a surge of admiration for Anne. Despite the heartbreak and shock of all she had learned, she still found the strength to support her son. The inspector nodded gravely. "Your cooperation will be taken into account, Mr. Dubois, and the fact that you were essentially blackmailed into doing their bidding will certainly weigh in your favor." At that moment, Sophie could no longer contain her curiosity. She pushed the door open and stepped into the room. All eyes turned toward her. "Sophie," Edith said gently, "you should be resting." "I want to help," Sophie declared, her voice small but determined. "What can I do?" Anne offered her a kind smile. "Oh, sweetheart, you've already done so much. You and Claire, you're the real heroes of this story." The inspector approached Sophie, lowering himself to eye level. "Actually," he said, "there's something very important you and your sister can do. We need you to tell us everything you saw and heard these past few days. Every detail could be crucial to our case." Sophie nodded solemnly. "I can do that." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Police officers came and went, bringing updates and collecting information. Sophie and Claire spent hours recounting everything they had witnessed, from the initial car accident to the dramatic escape the night before. As the day wore on, more details of the criminal operation emerged. The Nexus Corporation, it turned out, was only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lay an intricate web of illegal casinos, betting schemes, and money laundering stretching through several cities. "It's bigger than we imagined," the inspector admitted, rubbing tired eyes. "But thanks to your information, we're making arrests all over the city. The kingpins of the game are going down, one by one." Thomas, who had spent most of the day in interrogation, returned escorted by 2 officers. He looked pale, but there was a spark of resolve in his eyes that Sophie hadn't seen before. "Mom," he said, approaching Anne, I told them everything. About the debts, the staged accident, how they tried to force me to hand over the clean energy project. Anne pulled him into a tight hug. You did the right thing, son. I'm so proud of you. What happens to him now? Edith asked the inspector. He'll face charges, the officer answered honestly. Insurance fraud, involvement in illegal gambling. But his cooperation and the fact he was essentially a victim of extortion will be taken into account. With a good lawyer, there's a real chance of a reduced sentence. Sophie watched Thomas absorb this news with a mixture of fear and resignation. She approached him cautiously. Mr. Thomas, she said softly, I want you to know I don't blame you. You made mistakes, but you're trying to fix them. That's what counts, right? Thomas looked at her, tears filling his eyes. Sophie, he said, voice thick with emotion, you're an incredible little girl. Thank you. Your words mean more than you can imagine. As the afternoon wore on, more updates poured in. Several top kingpins of the game had been caught trying to flee the city. Bank accounts were frozen, properties seized. It's the end for them, the inspector declared with satisfaction. It may take time to dismantle the entire operation, but the blow we dealt them today, they won't recover from this. Anne, who had been on the phone for hours with lawyers and executives from her company, finally sat down, looking exhausted but relieved. The board of my company is shocked, of course, she told Edith, but they're willing to support Thomas and the clean energy project. They see the value in what he's created, despite everything. Edith smiled, hugging her old friend. It'll be all right, Annie. You're strong, you'll get through this. Sophie, watching it all unfold, felt a surge of emotion welling up. Tears began to streak her cheeks. Claire, noticing her sister's state, wrapped her arms around Sophie. Why are you crying, Sophie? Aren't we safe now? Sophie wiped at her tears, smiling through them. Yes, Claire, we're safe. I'm crying because sometimes, even when things seem very bad, people can still do the right thing. They can redeem themselves. Overhearing Anne approach the girls, Sophie's right, she said gently. The path to redemption isn't always easy or quick, but it's possible. Thomas is taking the first steps, and we'll support him. As night fell, a cautious optimism settled over the group. The criminals were being brought to justice. Long-buried secrets had come to light. And though challenges lay ahead, there was hope too. Sophie, seated between her sister and grandmother, gazed around the room. There was Anne, strong and compassionate despite everything. Thomas, shouldering the burden of his mistakes but determined to set things right. And the police officers, relentless in their pursuit of justice. She realized this wasn't the end of the story, but rather the start of a new chapter, a chapter of healing, rebuilding, and above all, redemption. And as sleep finally claimed her, Sophie smiled, knowing she had played her own part in this extraordinary journey, one that began with a single act of courage and now promised to change so many lives for the better. The road to redemption might be long, but with courage, compassion, and the truth on their side, Sophie knew it was a road worth traveling. Weeks had passed since the tumultuous events that had turned everyone's world upside down. The Dubois estate, once a site of secrets and tension, now radiated peace and renewal. The autumn sun bathed the gardens in golden hues, as if nature itself were celebrating this fresh start. Anne and Edith sat in wicker chairs on the terrace, watching Sophie and Claire run across the lawn, their laughter echoing through the property. The two older women, so different in appearance yet bound by decades of shared history, smiled at the scene before them. Who would have thought, Annie? Edith said softly, her eyes bright with emotion. After all these years, here we are. Anne reached out and squeezed her old friend's hand. I know. Sometimes I wonder how we let so much time slip by. The two friends had spent countless hours in recent days, reminiscing about the past and filling in the gaps of all those lost years. They laughed over youthful pranks, wept over missed opportunities, and most importantly, renewed the bond that time and circumstance had strained but never fully broken. Remember that summer at the beach? Anne asked, a nostalgic smile playing on her lips. When we decided we'd be friends forever? Edith chuckled softly. How could I forget? We made that solemn pact, buried a treasure box in the sand. With our matching friendship necklaces, Anne added, her eyes shining. I still have mine, you know. I still have mine too, Edith admitted, blushing slightly. They looked at each other, a quiet understanding passing between them. Despite the years of separation, despite the diverging paths their lives had taken, the core of their friendship had remained unbroken. Edith, Anne said seriously, promise me we won't let that happen again. No matter what life throws at us, we'll stay in touch. Edith nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. I promise, Annie. No more lost years. As they talked, they reflected on the journeys that had led them to this moment. Anne spoke of the challenges of building her business empire, the pressures of being a woman in a male-dominated world, and the joys and heartaches of motherhood. Edith recounted stories of her more modest life, the sacrifices she made to raise her family, and the strength she'd found during the hardest times. You know, Anne said thoughtfully, looking back, I see how every experience, every challenge shaped us, made us stronger, wiser. Edith agreed. Yes, and now that we're together again, imagine what we can achieve. Just then, Sophie and Claire bounded over, their cheeks flushed and their breathing heavy from playing. Grandma, Miss Dubois, Sophie called excitedly. Can we play by the fountain? Anne smiled warmly. Of course, dears. Just be careful, all right? As the girls ran back toward the garden, Edith noticed a glimmer in Anne's eyes. What are you thinking, Annie? She asked curiously. Anne straightened in her chair, her voice brimming with renewed energy. I've been thinking about those girls, Edith. Their bravery, their kindness. They've inspired me. And they made me think about all the other children out there who might not have the same opportunities. Edith tilted her head, intrigued. What do you have in mind? A project, Anne explained, her enthusiasm growing. A foundation, maybe, to help underprivileged kids, to give them opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. Education, healthcare, emotional support. What do you think? Edith's eyes lit up. Annie, that's wonderful, and I'd love to help however I can. No, Edith, Anne said firmly. I don't want you to just help. I want you to be my partner, 50-50. Your experience, your heart. That's exactly what this project needs. Edith was momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by her friend's generosity and trust. Oh, Annie, she finally managed, it would be an honor. The two friends spent the next few hours discussing their plans, voices animated and full of purpose. Sophie and Claire, curious about the excitement, occasionally wandered over to listen, their young faces shining with the hope of making a difference in the world. By late afternoon, it was clear that the Dubois estate had transformed. It was no longer just Anne's grand residence, but a home for all of them, a place of frequent visits, shared laughter, and new memories in the making. Why don't you stay? Anne insisted when Edith mentioned it might be time to head out. There's plenty of room here, and I'd love to have you close by, at least until we figure out the details of our project. Edith hesitated only a moment before agreeing, her heart brimming with gratitude for this second chance life had granted them. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Anne and Edith found themselves sitting on a garden bench. Sophie and Claire played near the fountain, their laughter ringing like music across the property. Look at them, Edith, Anne said softly. So full of life, so full of possibilities. It reminds me of us when we were young. Edith smiled, nodding. Yes, but now we have the wisdom to cherish every moment and not let time slip through our fingers again. The two friends hugged, their hearts full of love, gratitude, and hope for the future. Off to the side, Sophie watched them, a surge of emotion welling up inside her. She pulled Claire closer, hugging her younger sister. Look, Claire, she whispered. That's what true friendship looks like. That's what love looks like. Claire nodded solemnly, her big eyes fixed on the two women on the bench. As dusk gently settled over the Dubois estate, a palpable sense of new beginnings filled the air. Past secrets had been revealed, old wounds were healing, and the future shone brightly with promises of love, friendship, and shared purpose. Anne and Edith, two friends reunited by fate and bound by adversity, gazed at each other and smiled. They were no longer merely survivors of a tumultuous past, but the architects of a brighter tomorrow, one that, thanks to the courage of two small heroines, held boundless possibilities. And so, Under the velvety twilight sky, a new story began to take shape. A story of redemption, second chances, and above all, the enduring power of true friendship.